Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Broadband Universe podcast. I'm Craig Corbin, and it is very much a pleasure to welcome Jen Wade, Director of Risk Consulting with RSM. Jen, welcome to the Broadband Universe.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is always great to be able to catch up with people who are so involved in what's going on right now with BEAD. And in order to fully tell the story, let's let folks that aren't familiar with your story find out how you got to RSM.
Perfect. So I actually spent about 13-ish years at the state of Georgia, where I actually started as a legislative policy analyst intern at OPB. Then I moved to the agency side of things, where I worked at CJCC, writing and administering federal grants, several million in federal funds there, as well as having the privilege to work on criminal justice reform in the state. And then I moved over to GEMA Homeland Security, where I was assigned to GBI's GSAC. It's the Counterterrorism and Criminal Intelligence Fusion Center there. I did operation and grants management. Apparently, once you get grants, they just kind of stick with you for your entire career. So you'll hear a lot of that in my story. And so then I moved from being at GEMA Homeland Security, just assigned to GBI, to actually working for GBI, still in an operation capacity, and with the federal grants management for emergency management and public safety and their terrorism grants. I was at GBI for I think 8 years total. And then I moved over to a role at the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget that dramatically shifted my trajectory in the grant space and in broadband. I had the responsibility and privilege of creating and implementing COVID relief funds for the governor, Governor Kemp, and the citizens of Georgia. That included everything from broadband to water and sewer, negative economic impact, housing. You name it, we did it. It was a great program. But as a former state broadband leader, I worked with GTA to implement the state fiscal recovery funds, capital project funds, and then I initiated BEAD before I came to RSM. So I've really been on the front lines of the implementation, including some of the challenges and the joys, behind Georgia's broadband implementation. And, the GTA director that is still there implementing the program and implementing BEAD, she and I had the pleasure of also working with Treasury during the guidance shift in the uniform guidance with the state fiscal recovery funds and capital projects that really gave the flexibilities afforded to the ISPs in the program. And that was in May of 2023. And so we forged relationships with our federal partners that really made Georgia's program, so successful. I joined RSM a year ago, a year and a week ago. So we're a tax audit and consulting firm, and really grateful to be continuing my work on the broadband infrastructure projects. I'm still getting to work with Georgia as well as other programs too. And it's really been this kind of full circle ride for me, having seen the firsthand, impacts of the grant funds and what it's kind of done in my community and my state. And then just the ability to do this on the national level. I never would have thought, 4 or 5 years ago, if you told me, hey, here's this broadband funds that are connected with COVID, that I would still be doing this and just getting so much joy out of working with other states as well.
Well, as a fellow resident of Georgia, thank you for all that you did in the time with the state. What a phenomenal, diverse background that you had with the state. That is incredible. I have to go back to your mention of the time at the GBI. You are listed as being a law enforcement instructor, post-certified. That's impressive. How did that all happen?
How did it all happen? So part of the joy of working with law enforcement is being able to teach. And so again, going back to the grants, and they stick with you. And so a lot of the teaching that we did was not just even the law enforcement side. It was really about grants and how to utilize grant funds for your operations. When law enforcement capacity, historically, the public safety communities are really underfunded. And so we make sure that we use the grant funds in every way that we can, whether it's, if the grant allows to use, on weapons purchases and things like that, or vehicles, which traditionally they don't, using it to fund personnel and people and things like that. And so I went to to Gypstick which is an actually really difficult post officer certification. And it's a very stressful process, but very proud to still maintain that and hold that. And, the public safety realm also holds a very special place in my heart. GBI, they were my family, and I was there for so long, and I really treasure my time there and all the opportunities that I had. And so that post certification coming out of it was something that I am very proud of.
Well, and congratulations, and thank you for your work during that time. You made mention of so much of what was done on a grant basis in the state of Georgia before you transitioned to RSM. That obviously prepared you in a huge way for the work that you're doing now. Talk about that, if you would.
Yes, tremendously, actually. So, I mean, everything from the policy side of everything, as in, coming into it from OPB, really seeing the legislative side of everything and how funding flows down to agencies, how decisions are made, even on the grant funding and, where those funding streams go. And then kind of being thrust into this environment, into public safety at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, which is really where, I mean, again, I got my start. And, their robust program, they have, all of the grant specialists, all these different divisions. And I worked primarily on burn JAG funds, RSAT programs, et cetera. And so we did everything from the upfront risk assessments to the subrecipient monitoring, the desk reviews, going out on site with all of these, which is kind of where I got my love for public safety as well. But really learning the core behind 2 CFR 200, the uniform guidance, before the change that OMB did some updates on, but really learning how to implement the best practices of the compliance portion to make sure not only that the grantees were in compliance, but that the state was in compliance with this to protect the state from clawbacks of federal funds. And that trickles down to the subrecipients too.
And you touched on something that really, I think, is a theme of what we wanted to talk about today with regard to an aspect of the BEAD program that perhaps has not yet gotten as much attention as it should, and that's reporting and compliance. And when we talk about such a huge program nationwide that's huge for each state, each territory that's taking part in BEAD, it is not a 1 year process. It is a multi-year process. Talk about how you have approached embracing the huge task of helping people from a compliance standpoint.
Yeah, it's really unique in the fact that I think most of the providers that are kind of used to this are used to programs under, Reconnect and some other programs that came before this, even state fiscal recovery funds and capital project funds. And so, because they were COVID funds, fortunately for the states and the providers that, reap the benefits of this, there were a lot of flexibilities that were afforded under those programs, a lot. And I remember distinctly, I mentioned the uniform guidance update in May of 2023, and the director of the Broadband program at the time and we were working on this. And initially, these were traditional subawards that were made to the subrecipients. And then the ability to convert them to fixed awards came into play in May. And so, we use those flexibilities, the procurement flexibilities and things like that, because, really, even again, under, Reconnect and other programs, they're used to getting grant awards, but the way that these private, for-profit companies work, their procurement is not the same as it would be if it was a state agency or a nonprofit entity and things like that. And so that was a very, very difficult time in our program. And so if you fast forward now to the BEAD program, we have these enhanced requirements, right? And so we, even from the beginning when I was still back at the state, really trying to prepare them for these enhanced requirements. And I think a lot of the potential applicants at the time, because of the changes that were made on the Treasury side of things during state fiscal recovery and CPF, were really banking on the fact that some of this would be, released for them too, right? And they would, have a little bit of relief, from those requirements. And so we just kept pushing them to say, hopefully some of these requirements will be, harmonized with Treasury's guidance. And we hope that NTIA does do that. But we can't fixate on that and look to that. We have to go with what is written in the NOFO currently, right? And so, having them wrap their heads around that. While there are enhanced requirements, some of this stuff is not new, right?
Right.
We're familiar with BABA, right? Increased because it's a requirement, not a preference now.
Sure.
Davis-Bacon, that was a really, really big one for, providers under state fiscal and CPF. And the guidance that Treasury put out, I don't know if you recall, but they, in the guidance, it was listed as not a requirement because there was this alternative, this project impact report that you could do, right?
Right.
And so really this technical assistance, this constant getting in front of the internet service providers and all these providers to say, whoa, you can do Davis-Bacon, or, there is a recognized alternative for that. And so a lot of what we have really been doing in my role now at RSM is continuation of that, right? Providing technical assistance for the states, for their potential applicants. So they're all on an even playing field. But again, we also have like letter of credit, right? NEPA, permitting, all of those things that are enhanced. NEPA was not a requirement under state fiscal recovery funds or CPF, right? So Section 106 was not applicable to this. And so, again, all those flexibilities that I think that they kind of just got used to and look to in the future of possibly getting, relieved for them. While some of it did, and NTIA did try to harmonize mostly with Treasury's, uniform guidance updates, there are still some that they didn't. And so it is hard to wrap your head around all these different programs, especially when the providers typically didn't have compliance teams, right? And now we're starting to see where, we interact with folks all the time. Now they're on a compliance team, right? So starting to really understand what BABA is going to look like and what Davis-Bacon, looked like for SLURF and CPF.
Right.
The thresholds are different than they are in BEAD. Right. And so they really have to tick and tie to individual specific requirements for each assistance listing, CFDA, right, project number, and make sure they're tracking it that way.
And let's talk about that, because, when the awards are made, there are very real deadlines that have to be adhered to. Talk about the biggest challenges that you see from the ISPs.
Oh gosh, where to start? So I think the biggest challenge, I've already talked about the difference in programs. All the states, while the NOFO outlines very specific standards and requirements that each state has to comply with as they, put out their programs, and they have, different scoring criteria, et cetera. One of the biggest things we're, hearing is, some states are using the fixed awards that has been relaxed through the NTIA's harmonization with Treasury's ability to use fixed awards. So if states go that route, some states may opt to use the fixed awards, even though they still have to be on a reimbursement basis, right? And then other states may not elect to use the fixed award, right? They may just do a traditional reimbursement, still have your performance metrics, but they may just say, okay, we're having these thresholds. So each of those payment requests, right, and the fixed awards and how they set up their grant process is going to look different. And we've met with certain, providers, and we know that they're applying in multiple states, and they've already seen this challenge in state fiscal recovery and CPF, where they may be a subrecipient in Georgia and they might be a subrecipient in South Carolina, and those two states are dealing with both of those programs very differently.
Yep.
Very, very differently. So,
right.
We have really been proponents of engaging the teams in the discussion of all the applicable policy requirements, right? Because they have 2 CFR 200. They really need to understand that, because that is going to be everything that they're monitored on. And honestly, if we look at these BEAD applications, I don't know how many you've seen so far that came out, but Louisiana has theirs out. Their pre-eligibility, Montana has their application out, and these other states, they're lengthy. And some of them are doing pre-eligibility where they are making sure that these providers understand the requirements even prior to getting past a certain phase to the application, right? So it is imperative, if these guys want the money, they really have to demonstrate an understanding of just, not the 2 CFR 200, but the enhanced requirements, the understanding the Davis-Bacon that you'll certify or provide the alternative, demonstrating that you understand the letter of credit requirements, that, NEPA and permitting, all of those things, demonstrating that you have written policies and procedures. Some states applications, are asking, we have written application questions for states. We are engaged currently in doing those with states, and they really want to know up front, like, can you manage this award? Are you
Right.
competent enough to not commingle your funds, competent enough to, have written policies and procedures in place that, we will be checking on this monitoring side, right? And the states also have their own requirements they have to meet. They have to do pre-award risk assessments. It's a
Right.
requirement under 2 CFR 200. So they're assessing everyone's risk. And that plays into the monitoring piece of this, and how often they do site visits and desk reviews, how deep they go into your policies and procedures, based on what you demonstrate in your, risk assessment and application. And I think it's important for those providers to understand that, and I'm sure they've heard it a million times, and I just feel like I have to say it, but it's not free money. It
Right.
comes with, strings, and those strings are these federal requirements to keep, again, the state safe, but also to keep the provider safe, because
Sure.
no one wants to claw back funds, right? I'm sure you've seen the stories of misuse of funds and, all that. And, that's, Georgia's program was phenomenal in, putting together their risk mitigation plan.
Right.
And their, monitoring compliance. And I think providers really, if they haven't experienced it already, if they were contractors per se, right, under state fiscal recovery funds or CPF in another state, this is a little different. And, our group is going to be coming out, and other groups are going to be coming out and conducting speed tests to make sure that, your speed is in line with the BEAD requirements, and that you do have, reimbursement policies and procedures. And depending on fixed award, not fixed award, they could be looking at your invoicing.
Right. Right.
So there's so much. And I think the biggest thing too, and I know you and I have spoken about this, is there's so much still up in the air.
Right.
There's so much guidance.
The unknown.
The
Yep.
unknown. And so, when in doubt, we take the route, right? So the path is set out as it currently is. And if flexibilities happen, that is great. And I think the really good thing that, RSM is good at is just, we've had the experience already, right? Pivoting in state fiscal recovery and CPF, and working on, Reconnect and the overlaps on RDOF and all those things. And, we're in a good position. The states, whether they're doing it differently or not, they're not going to please every provider.
True.
And they have all these open comment periods on their volume 2s and things like that. But I would strongly encourage any applicant that is listening to this to go through the state's volume 2, if they haven't already. Check for updates too as it gets approved, right? But I would strongly encourage them to look through and identify what type of grant that they're getting themselves into, whether it's fixed award and they're going to have some procurement flexibilities, et cetera, or they might not, and they're going to have to procure this, which is going to add delays, on top of everything else, right?
And that's where being able to find some way to automate as much of that process as possible is key. You're watching the Broadband Universe podcast, brought to you by Lit Communities. Light up your community. You deserve better internet. And by Utopia Fiber. Utopia Fiber, bringing deliciously fast fiber internet to your neighborhood. My guest today, Jen Wade, Director of Risk Consulting with RSM. And, when you look at your experience, Jen, in this industry, it is amazing the opportunity that so many people have in what is a transformative opportunity nationwide. The lift is heavy for all the state offices that are dealing with these challenges. And one part of the process, once the awards are made for those that are going to be actually building, is getting permits to do just that. Permitting is something you talked about a little bit, touched on in your earlier remarks. And goodness, if you talk about trying to set your calendar with when you want to put shovel into dirt, the permitting aspect of that equation really makes it difficult to know how long it's going to take. How do you approach that concept?
I think the first and foremost, just identifying the challenges, right? Again, I've
Mm-hmm.
already said NEPA is applicable here.
Mm-hmm.
The flexibilities that everyone had on state fiscal recovery funds and CPF did not get rid of all those challenges. I
Mm-hmm.
was just talking to a provider before going to a broadband summit, and he gave me permission to share the story because it was just right in line with what we're talking about, with permitting. And it was what should have been an easy right of way. They thought the county owned the road. Turns out it was a privately owned road. And so, you know, again, that's on, capital projects and state fiscal recovery funds. And here we go with BEAD. And we know already the time permitting influx, right, let
Yeah.
alone, is going to increase. We've talked about the differences across programs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just on the application, how they run their program, but how they will be collecting the different documentation, how the locals interact in the permitting space as well. Another big challenge is going to be the submission process.
Yeah.
Incomplete permitting applications are going to be the number one driver of all the curing that goes back and forth, right? And the states have already seen an influx in, curing going back on their volume twos, right? And so that's just going to create, more delay. And again, I mentioned the permitting influx. BEAD permitting most is expected around 2026 to
Mm-hmm.
2028. They're going to have limited resources, right? Another challenge that we have heard from our, very rural providers, but no commercial power. The ISPs can't use the joint use agreements in those cases, and so some of the providers are already indicating that they're putting into their agreements that if they don't have any commercial power, even in future cases, they won't serve that location, right? And so
Interesting.
just understanding some of those, and we're talking about going to the most rural locations. That's what we're
Right.
trying to get unserved, first. And those are going to be those rural areas. So I think we've talked a lot to these ISPs about streamlining it. But I want to say this too, there's so many requirements, so many regulations. I feel like permitting is one that's kind of getting a little overlooked and starting to kind of gain steam with some of the
Sure.
updates that are coming out. Um, but what I think everyone's kind of focusing on individual requirements, right? Like BABA or Davis Bacon, they hear that they're like, whoa, 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 I thought it wasn't applicable. The little pieces kind of individually and not holistically. And so, really focusing on the streamlining of this permitting, because we're going to be, again, you mentioned the delays.
Yeah.
We're in for the long haul on this one. And so one thing, NTIA is going to review the applications. They are going to come through the states, right? So each state will, have their own, process, if you will, of how to do this. And NTIA is pushing, the states to hire qualified professionals to a kind of liaison between, the ISPs, the federal entities, the state, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, right? And RSM really saw this coming at the forefront, and we already hired the qualified professionals. We started to conduct, environmental analysis and look at the project areas in the state, pre and post challenge, kind of trying to get an understanding of where we will have this environmental concern, right?
Sure.
And so in doing this, we're going to liaison between, the grantees, the federal agencies, and the state to help them ensure will avoid permitting delays overarchingly. But also, again, I mentioned that incomplete applications are going to be like the number one reason these get kicked back.
Right.
And so, again, to cut down on the volume for the providers, like, let's get it right the first time. It might take a long time, but if you get it right the first time and get it right, and be on the front of everything, then your application is going to get reviewed faster. But it also cuts down on administrative burden for the states if they're not having to go back and forth, right, to cure these applications that are just missing, things that should have been an easy, not missing the application.
I love that mantra. Do it right the first time, and you avoid so much pain. Literally, we're talking about what will be a decade-long process. No one wanted to think of it in those terms, but that's the reality. And as we begin to wind down, and so much more that we could talk about here today, I'll ask you to look into the future for us. Where do you see this particular program, in specific, BEAD, evolving as we get into the time where projects are underway, and
Mhm.
there are the responsibilities for the reporting and compliance, and there continue to be the permitting challenges going forward.
Mhm.
What do you see changing from where we stand today?
I really think it's going to change before we get there. With the recent updates that NTIA have kind of pushed out to the states, so they are building this tool that the states will have to use to submit their permitting. Um, and this guidance that has yet to come out, in the guidance currently, no deployment can even happen before these permits get approved.
Mm-hmm.
And it is still unclear if they will allow ISPs to conduct permitting on a rolling basis, or if all the BSLs need to be included in that to get approved before they can break ground for anything. And so I think that's something that will fundamentally change the course of how we do things even before we get to deployment, right? Because we can't even get there until that happens. And so our team is really looking forward to this guidance being put out by NTIA. They're trying to streamline it by using this tool. But again, speaking of delays, if all those BSLs have to be in there and every single thing has to be right to avoid curing back and forth, got to get it right the first time on potentially a very large amount of BSLs, depending on the state and how they've laid out their project areas. If they do it on a rolling basis, which allows them more flexibility to be, splicing or doing whatever in the south of a county, for example, while they're working on permitting in the north of a county, then this creates more volume for NTIA and the state to submit and NTIA to review and the curing going back and forth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, just such a big challenge. And so I think even before we get to deployment, I think that's going to change probably in the next couple of months here before we even get to some states getting some awards out. But I think that we're going to get to the challenges on the compliance and monitoring piece. There's so many different things that I think you're going to start to see the providers really start engaging and getting help on the compliance pieces of this. But also looking, even before we get there, doing the analysis, looking at your surveys, trying to figure out where you're going to have to deal with, private landowners that want $10,000 for an easement on their property, or something like that. But I think that once we get in the swing of things, once we get past the permitting piece of it and we really have deployment, I think it's just really kicking it into the monitoring to make sure that, all the BSLs are being met with the speeds. And we have those flexibilities here now with the fixed awards, and to be able to do it on a, performance metric basis.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to slip into it. I think it really is going to be one of those things where we use lessons learned for state fiscal recovery funds, CPF, which is the down payment to BEAD, right? And the folks that are going to be applying for this have done it before. They know the requirements that are out there, and it's really just a matter of organizing that in a manner that they can meet the compliance, site visit requirements and things like that too. So I think we'll get
Patience.
there.
Yeah, patience will continue to be a virtue in this effort, no doubt. Obviously, this is a passion for you. It shows, and I know that it's rewarding both personally and professionally. What's the best part of the work that you're doing right now?
Seeing the impact in the community, and I know how cheesy it sounds when I say it, but I thought I would be a public servant for life. Again, years and years and years of my life was spent in the public sphere, and not just on broadband. When I got to the ARPA funds, it was a huge feat. I mean, $4.8 billion in Georgia that we had to implement. And it was very challenging to do all these kind of different programs. But when you see things like broadband that, especially on B, and even on B2, where it's really the most rural areas and helping people, it's the most disadvantaged communities. And I think we all take for granted. I'm sitting on here right now with my great Wi-Fi. We take it, we underestimate, what we're able to do because of, the internet. And kids during the pandemic couldn't even do their homework. They had to go to McDonald's. And we hear the story so much that I think that now it's just kind of commonplace. And again, we're not really seeing it, but to be working on it nationally and to continue the work in my home state, Craig, I can't tell you the joy that I feel. And I know how cheesy that sounds when I say it, but I get to see the impact, and I get to go on site visits, and I see it, and I see the homes that they're serving, and it is so rewarding.
It is so. It is truly, transformative, and it shows that it's a passion for you, and we appreciate what you have done for so many people for so long, and what you will continue to do. It has been great to visit. Can't wait for another opportunity to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. On behalf of Jen, thanks for letting us be a part of your day. We'll see you next time right here on the Broadband Universe. So long, everyone.